Good day to you. Listen, I don't mean to break your heart, but this is the last instructor video for the course. That's right, you've just about made it through, and so have I, through this pandemic, through the early part of the summer, 3 weeks of intense learning. We have a little bit more to do. What we're going to do is try and sum things up, try and bring it to a conclusion, this subject matter that we've been studying, comparing media from around the world. And if you do the reading, you note right away that the first question asks you to ask yourself, which element do you think has the greatest impact on a media system? Which of the elements that we've studied? Is it financing? Is it regulation? Is it cultural characteristics? Well, probably your answer is going to be that depends. It depends on the circumstance. But now you are able, because of this course, I hope, to be able to hone in on a media system by examining specific elements with a lot of detail and a lot of depth, and you have hopefully a greater understanding of the media system. It's opened up the media system to you by being able to examine it as a system. In fact, that's what I want to ask you next is, what have you learned about your own media system, having grown up in the United States? Many of you, it seemed, just by the way you introduced the answer to the question, what do you know about foreign media? Many of you seem to suggest you were a little bit undecided about what you knew about your own media system. It seemed as though you felt a little bit nervous about expressing that you don't know much about other countries, and you don't know why you don't know much. And now you know, right? It's because our media system is very insulated. It does not really teach us who the Prime Minister of Canada is or who the President of Mexico is. It doesn't really teach us a lot across the board. What it does is it entertains us. It entertains us, our media system, because it's a profit-making system. More about that a little bit later. So let's look at where we've come in the course. We started out by saying, the world is really too big to be able to conceptualize. It's got too many people. It has too many countries, 200 countries, got too many languages, 7,000 languages. It's really impossible to get to know. Many people have as a goal that they just strictly want to get to know the West Coast in the United States, or they want to go see Montana, big sky country, or they want to go down to Florida. The rest of the world is an even larger entity to try and conceptualize, that is more impossible because of its size. So the world is a really, really big place, and that means that what we do know about other countries comes largely through media content. It comes largely through the internet. It comes through social media. It comes through the TV shows that we watch and the films that we see. That's how we mostly have ideas about other parts of the world. I mean, I have a lot of ideas about what Cuba looks like, but I've never been there. So I know that these images that I have of these old 1950s cars driving around and people smoking cigars and sitting there with fedoras on, I don't know whether that's accurate or not. I don't know whether that's a certain type of person who's like that. I have to go on the images that I've learned about Cuba through the media. And it's the same for most of you in this class about other countries. What we know about the rest of the world, we know through media. And that means that your range of outlets that you access are going to determine what you know and also what you don't know. And knowing what you don't know is part and parcel of this class. It's that question of epistemology. It's learning how your knowledge is limited. So your range of sources is going to expand your knowledge. If you're not just accessing American media, you're accessing Canadian media and British media, which I hope becomes part of your consumption patterns in the future now that you've taken this course, or even despite the course. Or if you want to access Spanish language media or French language media, those are all ways to get to know exactly what the rest of the world is looking like in terms of its media systems. And knowing as much as you can about the rest of the world is going to be dependent on the sources of media that you access. Now, what is causing all of this circulation of media content around the world? Well, as we noted at the outset of this book, it is largely a profit-seeking motive that is going on. Mostly what's happening in the context of globalization is global conglomerates, big media conglomerates, not just media conglomerates. I mean, you have your oil companies, for example, you have your travel companies, your airlines. Those are conglomerates too, but media conglomerates have a place inside of the globalization climate as well. And they are what are driving the stretch of media content going all over the world. It's the profit-making motive is what's pushing this, not governments that is circulating media around the world, although you have that, but it's primarily global media conglomerates seeking new markets, seeking new target markets because ceilings have been reached in the domestic market. Now, we've been studying media as a system, and we've done that so that we understand that it has a lot of moving parts to it. They're all interrelated. We called them elements, but also because a media system is organic. It's constantly changing. And those media systems that interchange with outside media systems are going to be more organic. They're going to be more changeable. And those that have a more insulated pattern to their development and their interchange of information, those are going to be more parochial, going to be more in tune with one particular viewpoint, one particular ideology, one particular way of seeing the world. So a media system is an organic system. It's like a plant, and it gets affected by elements that are both part of the system and also outside forces as well. Now we come to the larger issues of talking about the major policy decisions that governments and peoples and regulatory agencies and advertisers and businesses and nonprofit organizations, major policy issues that this book has identified that all of these entities face when they are designing a media system for a country. So let's review some of those and talk about the ads and the disads. So the first is the idea of whether media should be public or private. That is, whether media should be publicly owned, meaning not having to make a bottom line. Well, I shouldn't say that all media have to meet their bottom line, but should not be profit making. That would make them public media. Or whether media should be, as is the case for other businesses, a business for people to have the right to own, to make a profit from, to make a living, to produce good stuff. What should the purpose of media be? Should they be private or should they be public? And what should the mix be? Should you have a half and half mix, like you have in most European countries, or should you just allow the free market to decide what the mix is going to be, which is the way it is in the United States? Should you have 90% of your media private and 10% public? Should you have a 50-50 split? Should you have 90% public, 10% private? That's a major policy decision that governments face, and a lot of their decision making has to do with their view of the impact of media on people's lives and whether people should be protected from the media or whether people should be served by media that are public because they wouldn't be served by media that are private in quite the same way. These are the major policy issues, the first one being public versus private. A second policy issue is whether media should be free and open. I mean free both cost-wise and also free to publish, broadcast, print, whatever content that they want. Should media be totally free? I mean, we live in a so-called free democracy, do we not? And it was the Greeks who had the idea that, just let people talk about bad ideas, let people talk about terrorism if they want to, let people talk about racism if they want to. The bad ideas are going to lose out against the good ideas in a society that truly has the ability to robustly debate issues. It was the Greeks who talked about that. And our democracy is founded very much on the Greek ideals of democracy. So would it not make sense to just let people say whatever they want, to let any content air? Well, no. We've decided as a society, and other societies have decided the same thing. No, not all media should be free and open, that media have a responsibility and that the content in some cases needs to be curtailed to protect people like innocent children. So free versus open is a very difficult issue to resolve. The interesting thing that I found when I wrote the book about the free versus open dimension is I had approached the countries that I was studying with a very similar approach to one that you might have, and that is to assume that those communist countries, the Chinas of the world, the Cubas, the North Koreas, the former communist Russia, those countries, they block media content. They are authoritarian countries. They stop content from coming in. They don't let people in their own country criticize government, so they censor that content. It's very easy to make that judgment about communist countries, and there's a lot of accuracy to it. However, what I did not realize until I researched the book is that in our country, we have the same thing going on, but it's through a different means. We have a lot of content that's blocked from other countries. We have a lot of content that's blocked within our own country. But strictly speaking, As we mentioned many times in this class, you turn on your television, how far do you have to go in your channel lineup to find anything foreign? When was the last time you heard a French song on American radio, if ever? Spanish songs, yeah, maybe once or twice. Some Spanglish, you can hear some Spanglish songs, a mixture between English and Spanish, a few Spanish words thrown in there. Not too much Spanish music unless you get into urban areas. So we have a situation in our country where a lot of content is blocked. Most people have never had a conversation with a communist. I mean, how amazing is that? China has like 1.3 billion people that consider themselves communists. And have you ever really had a conversation with somebody about a communist? So in our society and in our media landscape as well, we have blocking going on. We have the censorship of media content going on. And why is that? It's we're doing it to ourselves. We are self-censoring ourselves. Yeah, media companies are deciding, no, we don't want other media. We don't want media from foreign countries coming in here because we want to dominate the market. So it brings up the idea, is capitalism really as free and open as we make it out to be in comparison with communism when it comes to the end result? The end result of what kind of media content do we have access to? Next up, as a policy issue, is the policy issue about news reporting, specifically about news reporting and whether news reporting should be a product, that is the news story, whether it should be a product that's for sale, that's sponsored by advertising, or whether it should be a service that's provided by media organizations that are collecting tax money from the government, or whether news should be propaganda, as it is in China. China actually has a ministry of propaganda, so news reporting is an arm of the Chinese government that is designed to help the Chinese government have a perception around the world, a can-do government, always looking out for the people. Great things are happening in China. The leader is shaking hands of another world leader and striking another agreement. That's very often what Chinese media is looking like, Chinese news media. It's propaganda. They even call itself propaganda. Propaganda is not a dirty word in China. It's an interesting question. When is news a product, and when is it a service, and when is it propaganda, or is it all three all the time? That is the really big takeaway from this policy discussion, and that is to apply skepticism to the news. News is not pure information. It's delivered by human beings. Human beings cannot be completely objective. News is delivered within a media system that is going to reflect the ideology of the country that you're from. I mean, we never have capitalism, or we hardly have capitalism critiqued in our country in the news. It's sort of understood that it's the best system. That's an undercurrent of our news. And in China, you have the opposite. You don't have any questioning whatsoever of communism. It's understood that it's the best system. So how can two countries have completely different opposite systems and the peoples both believe with equal conviction that their system is the best? It's because we're convinced to be that way. We're cultivated to believe that way by virtue of growing up in the country. If you had grown up in China, think about it, you'd be a communist. So is it in you, or is it in the system and the society that you grow up in? Apply skepticism to the news. It has an ideology to it. It looks favorably overall upon the country that it's coming out of, and pales and makes the rest of the countries pale in comparison. Now let's go on to another policy issue. It has to do with that big collection of terms that somehow go together but really are separate, and those terms are nudity, profanity, and sexuality. A lot of countries face the decision, what do we do? Do we let media reflect real life? And if people are naked in real life, I mean, almost everybody takes a shower every day. It's getting naked almost every day. Are people allowed to be portrayed in their natural state in media? Or do we need to protect children? Or is there an immoral element to showing naked bodies, or having somebody swear, or showing sexual intercourse, or any kind of sexual activity? Is there a moral component that's wrong about that according to a religious or other standard? Or is nudity another example of art? The human body is an artistic art form. I mean, we wouldn't have so many sculptures of the human body going back across every civilization that are sitting right now in our museums with depicting people with no clothes on. It's because the body is beautiful to look at. So should the body not also be expressed artistically in our media, in our average media? Or are there certain times of the day when we shouldn't do that because children might be watching? Or are there certain media that we shouldn't do that on because they're free and open media and anybody can be exposed to it if they walk in front of a television set? These are questions that have been asked and have been answered in very different ways. Even within Europe, we can look at Europe as having a very across the board approach to nudity profanity, but that's not the case. In France, for example, you will often see an equality between males and females being naked in terms of a man's behind and a woman's breasts. But when it comes to a vagina and a penis, those are not as often shown as is the case in Sweden. Sweden just flat out has nakedness as part of the routine. I mean, there was a time when you could go to the beach in Sweden and people just change around on the beach. They don't wear towels, and they have saunas all over Sweden. You go into a sauna and you sit in a sauna with your neighbors and sometimes your relatives, and you're naked, and then you go for a swim in the lake. It's supposed to open up the pores, and then you go for the swim in the lake and it purges the toxins. That's part of the Swedish outlook. And the French have a similar naturalistic view of the body. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we have very strict rules and regulations about nudity. What ends up happening is we'll have a lovemaking scene on television, and the woman will start to undress and she'll turn her back to the camera just at the moment that her breast might have been exposed. And the same for a man taking off his pants. So actually what's going on there is a lot of teasing, right? I mean, what person who's watching that program doesn't fill in the imagery that's just been hidden from you? You fill it in. It's what your normal instinct is to do. You try and guess what is being hinted at really looks like, but you can't see it because our laws prohibit us from doing that. And even in newspapers, there are no regulations. You will not find profanity. You will not find the average writer using words. I mean, we've seen more of it in the last few years, in part because we do see it coming out of, I believe, out of the presidency. We do see more swearing going on, but still we have a lot of strict rules. So this question of nudity, profanity, sexuality, it all gets mixed up. They're not really the same. They all get mixed up into policy decisions about what should be allowed. In most countries, they do prohibit, in very graphic terms, penetration is what's described in a lot of the European regulations. They're allowed to show everything else when people are having sex except for quote unquote penetration. Then it becomes pornography. The last area of policymaking that I want to talk about is violence. Violence, again, another difficult decision to make about how are you going to set your media system up. Do you want it to actually depict real life violence as it is so that people realize the horrors of war, the horrors of early death, the horrors of suicide, the horrors of somebody taking somebody else's life? Do we want people to know in a reality sense what those kinds of events are really like and what they do? Or do we want to stop people from seeing violence because it's offensive, or because the violence against the person is just going to bring it all back to the family members if we show that violence again? Or do we not show it because it will encourage people, we think, to become more violent? In our country, we don't really have a lot of restraints on violence. I mean, television programmers, they choose when it's fiction to show a lot of violence. There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of sounds of gunshots. There's a lot of sounds of fists against people's faces. That goes across our television almost every single night, maybe every single night, and certainly in our films as well. And video gaming, I mean, I know a lot of video gamers feel picked upon by people who say, oh, you play video games, you're going to become a mass murderer, and it's ridiculous. But video games also depicting violence in extremely graphic and insensitive ways. I mean, you become a person, you take on their avatar and kill people, and then you go have lunch. So, violence is a very difficult thing to take on. And what do you do when you're covering a war? So some countries have decided, we're going to divide between violence that's fictional, and we're going to say fictional violence we're going to curtail. We're going to, prevent the sounds of bones being crushed. That's actually in the French regulations. You cannot have audio that sounds like bones are being crushed when you have violence on television. So there's that approach that you can try and curtail fictional violence, the thinking being that fictional violence doesn't communicate the right message about violence. It gets people to believe that there are no consequences, that nobody gets hurt, or that if you get hurt, you recover the next day. None of this addresses real violence. You're walking around with a limp for the rest of your life. You don't see that in most films and most TV shows. And so is that kind of violence in fictional programming, fictional content to be limited because it's not teaching people the correct moral lesson that there are consequences to violence? I mean, we have a lot of violence in our country right now. It's being talked about in the context of race relations. It's just one dimension of violence that we have in our country. You have only to read the police blotter in your town and you will see the violence is happening every single day around you. So why is that? Is it related to our media use? I think it's worth asking the question. Once again, some countries have said, we're going to say that fictional violence needs to be curtailed, censored, presented in a certain way. However, reality violence, war, murder, that needs to be presented as is, as tastefully as possible, meaning making sure that family members are notified. We have the opposite in our country. We allow fictional violence, but when it comes to reality violence, we don't show it too much. So now we arrive at the end of the course, just about one more day. And really what this course comes down to, I would like to think, is now you are prepared to avoid cultural myopia as you go through your life. You're prepared to recognize when you are looking at another country through the eyes of your own country and the tendency that could be there to judge that other country because of the ideals that you've grown up with in the media system in your own country. That's ultimately what I want you to be able to come away from this class with, is the ability to resist cultural myopia. Because when we have cultural myopia, that short-sightedness, that is making evaluations of things at a distance using only what we have experienced close up. If we continue to operate in that way, then what happens is we end up shrinking in our intellectual, personal, and social development. You end up shrinking. You end up caving into a kind of self-knowing enclosure that has stopped you from expanding, doing the opposite, learning more, learning other perspectives. All of this can come about through media use. Really quite amazing. Have a great day.